September 7th, 1566, the Hungarian Thermopylae. Count Miklos Zrínyi stands in the burning courtyard of Szigetvar's inner castle. His armor is scorched black. His sword arm trembles from 33 days of unrelenting combat. Behind him, the fortress walls that his ancestors built are crumbling into ash and rubble. Before him, through a single gate barely wide enough for 4 men abreast, waits an army of 100,000 Ottoman warriors. He has 600 men left. 600 against 100,000. The mathematics of this moment are not complex. They are absolute. There will be no reinforcements. There will be no retreat. Vienna has abandoned them. The Holy Roman Emperor has written off this fortress and every soul within it. The greatest military machine the world has ever known, the army that conquered Constantinople, that subjugated 3 continents, that made kings tremble from the Danube to the Persian Gulf, has spent an entire month trying to break this one small castle on the Hungarian frontier. And today, that castle will fall. But Zrínyi does not kneel. He does not surrender. He does not beg for terms or offer tribute or prostrate himself before the overwhelming might of the Ottoman Sultan. Instead, he straps a key to his belt, the key to the powder magazine beneath his feet, where 100 pounds of gunpowder waits with a lit fuse. He draws his saber. He faces his remaining men, their faces gaunt with starvation, their bodies carved with wounds, their eyes burning with something beyond fear, and he gives an order that will echo through 5 centuries of history. Let us go out from this burning place into the open and stand up to our enemies. Let us not be burned like pigs. What happened next would halt the greatest empire on earth. It would save Vienna. It would change the balance of power in Europe for generations, and it would transform a doomed Croatian count into an immortal legend. But this final moment, this suicide charge into the mouth of hell, was only the last act of a siege so brutal, so savage, so utterly apocalyptic that Ottoman soldiers who survived it would refuse to speak of what they witnessed. This is the story of Szigetvar, the siege that killed an empire. To understand why 2,300 men chose to die in a swamp fortress on the Hungarian frontier, we must first understand the force they faced. We must understand the Ottoman Empire at the zenith of its power, and we must understand the man who commanded it. Suleiman the Magnificent had been Sultan for 46 years when he turned his attention toward Szigetvar in 1566. 46 years of unbroken military success. 46 years of expansion that had transformed a powerful regional state into the most formidable empire since Rome. Consider the scope of his conquests. In 1521, the 3rd year of his reign, Suleiman had captured Belgrade, the fortress that had resisted his great-grandfather and served as the key to Central Europe for generations. In 1522, he had expelled the Knights of St. John from Rhodes, ending a 2-century Christian presence in the eastern Mediterranean. In 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs, he had annihilated the Hungarian army in less than 2 hours, killing King Louis II and shattering the medieval kingdom of Hungary into fragments that would never fully reassemble. He had taken Baghdad. He had conquered most of North Africa. His fleets dominated the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf. His empire stretched from the walls of Vienna to the borders of Persia, from the steppes of Ukraine to the coasts of Yemen. At its peak, the Ottoman state controlled 25 million subjects and fielded armies that no Christian power could match in the open field. The Europeans called him the Magnificent. The Ottomans called him Kanuni, the lawgiver, recognizing that his achievements extended beyond military conquest to systematic legal and administrative reform. His court poet called him the shadow of God on earth. His enemies simply called him invincible. By 1566, Suleiman was 71 years old. His body was failing. Gout had crippled his legs to the point where he could no longer ride a horse and had to be carried in a litter. His digestive system was ravaged by decades of campaign food and court intrigue. His heart was weakening. Court physicians privately worried that any significant exertion could kill him, but the Sultan was determined to lead one final campaign. One last great expedition to secure his legacy and complete the conquest of Hungary that he had begun 4 decades earlier at Mohács. His target was Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Empire, the seat of the Holy Roman Emperor, the symbolic heart of Catholic Europe. Take Vienna, and the path to Rome itself lay open. Take Vienna, and Ottoman dominion over the continent would be assured for generations. There was just one obstacle, a small fortress guarding the road through Hungary, a castle called Szigetvár, commanded by a Croatian nobleman named Miklos Zrinyi. The Sultan considered it a minor inconvenience. His generals estimated it would fall in 3 days, perhaps 4. The army would barely slow its march. They were catastrophically wrong. Who was this man who dared to defy an empire? Miklos Zrinyi, known in Croatian as Nikola Šubić Zrinski, came from one of the oldest noble families in the Croatian lands. The Zrinyis had fought Ottomans for generations, losing lands, wealth, and family members in the endless border wars that had consumed southeastern Europe since Constantinople fell in 1453. For Miklos, resistance to Ottoman expansion was not merely a political choice. It was a blood inheritance passed from father to son across a century of carnage. By 1566, Zrinyi was approximately 58 years old, elderly by the standards of his era, especially for a man who had spent his entire adult life in combat. He had served the Habsburg crown for decades, fighting in campaigns across Hungary and Croatia, earning a reputation for aggressive tactics and personal bravery that bordered on recklessness. He was not a strategist in the grand sense. He was a fighter, a survivor, a man who had looked into the eyes of Ottoman warriors countless times and lived to tell about it. In 1561, Zrinyi had been appointed Ban of Croatia, effectively the military governor of the Croatian frontier, responsible for organizing the defense of the borderlands against Ottoman raids. It was a position that carried immense responsibility and minimal support. The Habsburg treasury was perpetually empty. The reinforcements promised from Vienna arrived late or not at all. The local nobility squabbled over precedence while Ottoman raiders burned their villages. Zrinyi had grown accustomed to fighting with whatever resources he could scrape together, abandoned by an empire that valued his service but refused to pay for it. Szigetvár itself was technically not part of Zrinyi's jurisdiction. The fortress belonged to the Kingdom of Hungary, not Croatia, and its defense was theoretically the responsibility of the Hungarian nobles and the Habsburg imperial administration. But when reports reached Zrinyi in mid-1566 that Suleiman himself was leading an unprecedented army toward the Hungarian frontier, the Ban of Croatia understood that the formal boundaries of his authority were irrelevant. If Szigetvár fell quickly, the Ottoman army would sweep through Croatia on its way to Vienna. His own lands, his own people, his own family would be in the path of that hurricane. Zrinyi rode to Szigetvár with a personal guard of approximately 400 Croatian cavalry. When he arrived, he found a garrison of roughly 1,900 men, a mix of Croatian and Hungarian soldiers, local militia, and a small contingent of professional troops. The fortress itself was modest by the standards of major European fortifications. It consisted of 3 concentric defensive zones, an old town to the south, a new town in the center, and an inner castle on a small island surrounded by swampy ground and artificial waterways. The walls were built for medieval warfare, not for resisting the massive siege cannons that the Ottomans had perfected over generations of conquest. Zrinyi assessed the situation with the cold eye of a veteran. The fortress could not hold indefinitely. The garrison was too small, the walls too weak, the supplies too limited. Reinforcements from Vienna were not coming. Emperor Maximilian II had already made the strategic decision to concentrate his forces at Vienna itself, writing off the Hungarian frontier as indefensible. Every man in Szigetvár was, in the cold calculus of imperial strategy, expendable. But expendable did not mean useless. Zrínyi understood that even a doomed fortress could serve a purpose. Every day the Ottoman army spent beneath these walls was a day it could not spend marching toward Vienna. Every soldier killed in these ditches was a soldier who would not assault the Habsburg capital. Every artillery shell expended against these ramparts was a shell that would not breach Austrian defenses. The defenders of Szigetvár could not win, but they could make the Ottomans pay for their victory in blood and time. They could transform their deaths into a weapon. Zrínyi gathered his officers and explained the strategic reality. He did not sugarcoat it. He did not offer false hope of rescue or relief. He told them exactly what they faced and exactly what their sacrifice would mean. Any man who wished to leave before the siege began would be allowed to depart with honor. There would be no shame in choosing life. According to later accounts, not a single officer accepted the offer. They understood what Zrínyi understood. They had made their choice. The Lion of Croatia prepared to receive the shadow of God. The Ottoman army that approached Szigetvár in the first days of August of 1566 was the largest military force Suleiman had ever assembled for a European campaign. Contemporary sources offer varying estimates, but modern historians generally accept a figure of approximately 100,000 combatants, supported by an additional 50,000 camp followers, engineers, laborers, and support personnel. The core of this force was the Janissary Corps, 12,000 elite infantry who represented the finest soldiers in the known world. Originally recruited through the Defying system, which selected Christian boys from conquered territories for conversion and military training, the Janissaries were professional soldiers in an age of amateur armies. They trained constantly. They were equipped with the latest firearms and military technology. They fought with the disciplined ferocity of men who had known no other life. European commanders who faced Janissaries in open battle routinely described them as the most formidable opponents they had ever encountered. Supporting the Janissaries were approximately 15,000 Sipahi cavalry, feudal horsemen drawn from across the empire who owed military service in exchange for land grants. These were not the light raiders who had terrorized the Hungarian frontier for decades. They were heavy cavalry, equipped with armor and weapons designed for decisive battlefield shock. Behind them came provincial infantry levies, specialized siege troops, sappers and engineers, and the vast logistical train required to sustain such a host in the field. The artillery was particularly terrifying. The Ottomans had been pioneers of gunpowder warfare since before the fall of Constantinople, and their siege train represented over a century of accumulated expertise. 300 cannon accompanied the army, ranging from light field pieces to massive siege bombards capable of hurling stone balls weighing 800 pounds. The engineers who operated these weapons had breached walls that Europeans had considered impregnable. They had reduced fortresses across 3 continents to rubble. This army moved with terrifying efficiency. The Ottoman military machine had perfected the logistics of large-scale campaigning across diverse terrain, establishing supply depots, maintaining discipline on the march, and coordinating the movement of disparate units across vast distances. Where European armies often dissolved into chaos within weeks of beginning a campaign, their soldiers deserting, their supplies running out, their commanders quarreling, Ottoman forces could maintain cohesion and combat effectiveness for entire seasons. Suleiman himself traveled at the center of this host, carried in an elaborate litter because his gout-ridden legs could no longer support him on horseback. Attendants held parasols to shade him from the summer sun. Physicians traveled with his entourage, monitoring his deteriorating health with increasing anxiety. The Sultan was visibly aging, his famous energy fading, his legendary stamina eroding with each passing mile. But his presence remained essential. The Ottoman army fought for Allah and for gold, certainly, but above all, it fought for the Sultan. Suleiman's personal leadership had galvanized his troops for nearly half a century. His mere presence on a campaign was considered an omen of victory. For the soldiers marching through the Hungarian summer, the knowledge that the shadow of God himself rode among them was worth 10,000 additional troops. On August 5, 1566, the Ottoman vanguard appeared before Szigetvár. The riders who crested the hills east of the fortress found themselves looking down at a modest castle surrounded by swamps and marshland, its walls patrolled by a handful of sentries, its towers flying the Habsburg eagle. It seemed almost laughably inadequate, a frontier outpost that would collapse at the first serious assault. They sent word back to the main army. The fortress was in sight. The siege could begin. The Ottoman High Command estimated 3 days. Perhaps 4. Then they would continue toward Vienna. The Siege of Szigetvár officially began on August 6, 1566, when Ottoman engineers started constructing the siege works that would eventually surround the fortress. But combat came even earlier. Zrínyi had no intention of passively awaiting the enemy's preparations. On the night of August 5th, before the Ottoman army had fully arrived, Croatian cavalry swept out of Szigetvár's gates under cover of darkness. They struck the Ottoman vanguard camp without warning, killing sentries, scattering horses, setting fire to supply wagons. The raid accomplished little in military terms. The Ottoman force was far too large to be seriously damaged by such pinpricks, but it sent a message. This garrison would not cower behind its walls. This garrison would fight. The Ottomans responded with overwhelming force. By August 7th, siege lines completely encircled the fortress, cutting off any possibility of escape or resupply. Artillery batteries were positioned on the high ground east of the castle, and the bombardment began with a thunder that could be heard 20 miles away. Imagine the sound, hundreds of cannon firing in coordinated volleys, their reports blending into a continuous roar that made the earth itself tremble. Stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds crashing into medieval walls, with impacts that shattered masonry and killed anyone unlucky enough to be standing nearby. The shriek of smaller caliber shot tearing through the air, the crash of collapsing towers, the screams of the wounded. This was not combat as the medieval world had known it. This was industrial warfare, mechanized destruction on a scale that European observers found almost incomprehensible. The Ottoman siege train represented 2 centuries of accumulated firepower, and it was now focused on walls that had been built to resist arrows and scaling ladders. Yet Szigetvár did not fall. Zrínyi had prepared for the bombardment as best he could, pulling his forces back from the most exposed positions and ordering the construction of earthwork reinforcements behind the stone walls. When Ottoman shells punched through masonry, the packed earth absorbed their impact. When towers collapsed, the rubble itself formed new defensive obstacles. The garrison learned to move during the brief pauses between bombardment cycles, to shelter in prepared positions, to keep their powder dry and their weapons ready. More importantly, Zrínyi refused to let the Ottoman artillery operate unmolested. Night after night, Croatian sorties struck at the siege lines. They killed engineers. They spiked cannon. They set fire to ammunition wagons and powder stores. They made the Ottoman gunners afraid to operate at night, forcing them to wait for daylight and reducing the hours available for bombardment. The cost was horrific. Every sortie left bodies in the ditches. Every night raid meant men who did not return to the fortress. Zrínyi was trading lives for time, and the exchange rate was merciless. But the effect on Ottoman morale was equally significant. These were not the terrified peasants the Janissaries were accustomed to facing. These were wolves. By mid-August, the Ottoman assault began in earnest. Suleiman ordered the first major infantry attack on the old town, the southernmost section of Szigetvar's defenses. Janissary shock troops stormed the walls behind a covering bombardment, expecting to sweep over demoralized defenders and open the way into the fortress interior. Instead, they walked into a killing ground. The assault on the old town began on August 19th, after 2 weeks of constant bombardment had opened several breaches in the southern walls. Ottoman commanders believed the defenders must be exhausted, their ammunition depleted, their morale shattered. The Janissaries advanced with confidence, their war cries echoing across the marshland. They were met with a volume of fire that stunned veterans who had stormed fortresses across 3 continents. Zrínyi had concentrated his best arquebusiers, soldiers armed with early firearms, in positions overlooking the breaches. He had positioned his remaining cannon to cover the approaches with grape shot. He had prepared barrels of burning pitch, boulders for dropping on attackers, stakes and caltrops to channel the assault into kill zones. Every inch of ground the Ottomans would gain had been designed to cost them blood. The first wave of Janissaries died in heaps at the base of the breaches. The second wave climbed over the bodies of their comrades only to meet Croatian swordsmen in the gaps. Men who had been fighting Ottomans since childhood, who knew their techniques, who felt no fear. The third wave finally gained a foothold on the rubble, but found themselves in a maze of prepared positions, taking fire from multiple directions, unable to advance or retreat. By nightfall, the Ottoman assault had been repulsed with staggering casualties. Hundreds of elite Janissaries lay dead in the ditches and breaches. The walls of the old town had held. But Zrínyi knew this was only the beginning. The Ottoman army settled in for systematic reduction. If they could not storm the walls, they would undermine them. Sappers began digging tunnels beneath the old town's fortifications, packing them with gunpowder for demolition. Counter-miners from the garrison tried to intercept these tunnels, leading to desperate underground combat in passages barely wide enough for a man to swing an axe. Men fought in darkness, in mud, in air so foul that torches would not burn. They drowned when defenders flooded the passages. They burned when fires were set at tunnel mouths. They died from suffocation, from cave-ins, from knife wounds in the blackness. On August 21st, a massive mine detonation brought down a section of the old town's main wall. The explosion was so powerful that it was felt inside Suleiman's tent, a quarter-mile away. A column of fire and debris rose into the sky, and when the smoke cleared, a gap 50 feet wide had been blasted through the fortifications. The Janissaries attacked immediately, pouring through the breach before the defenders could recover. This time, there were simply too many of them. Croatian defenders fought hand-to-hand in the rubble, but they were outnumbered 10-1, and the weight of Ottoman numbers pushed them inexorably backward. Zrínyi ordered the retreat to the new town. The withdrawal was conducted under fire, the rearguard dying almost to a man to buy time for their comrades to fall back across the bridges connecting the old town to the central fortifications. Ottoman soldiers, crazed with battle fever, pursued so closely that defenders and attackers were mixed together in the narrow passages, stabbing and slashing and drowning in the ditches that separated the defensive zones. By sunset on August 22nd, the old town was in Ottoman hands. The siege had lasted 17 days. Zrínyi had lost approximately 600 men, a quarter of his original garrison, but the Ottomans had lost over 5,000. The capture of the old town should have been decisive. Standard siege doctrine held that once the outer defenses fell, the inner works would follow quickly. The defenders' morale would collapse. Their supplies would run low. Their leaders would recognize the futility of further resistance and negotiate terms. Zrínyi did not negotiate. If you appreciate stories like this, consider subscribing to Not Nostalgic History. We explore the battles and turning points that shaped our world. Not with nostalgia, but with the unflinching honesty these stories deserve. The men of Szigetvár trusted their story to history. Help us make sure history remembers. The fighting for the new town began on August 23rd and would last for 9 more blood-soaked days. Every tactic that had failed in the old town was repeated with increasing desperation. Artillery bombardment, mining operations, mass infantry assaults. Each time, the defenders repulsed the attacks with the same savage determination that had characterized the first phase of the siege. Conditions inside the fortress were deteriorating rapidly. Food supplies were running low. Fresh water had to be rationed as Ottoman engineers systematically destroyed the wells and cisterns within range of their artillery. Ammunition stocks were critically depleted. Defenders were reduced to collecting spent Ottoman musket balls and reloading them for use. The unwounded were becoming rare. Most of the garrison now carried injuries that would have invalidated them from service in any normal campaign. And still they fought. Ottoman commanders began to report a disturbing phenomenon to Suleiman's tent. The garrison was not behaving like a besieged force. There were no signs of the demoralization that normally preceded surrender, no deserters attempting to slip through the lines, no secret messages offering to negotiate, no visible erosion of defensive preparations. If anything, the resistance was becoming more intense as the siege continued. The men of Szigetvár seemed to be drawing strength from their approaching deaths rather than despairing at them. Suleiman himself was showing signs of strain. The 71-year-old Sultan had expected to be celebrating the fall of Szigetvár within a week of arrival. Instead, he was watching his finest troops bleed themselves white against walls defended by a handful of Croatians. His gout was flaring. His physicians were increasingly alarmed by symptoms that suggested his heart was failing. The stress of the protracted siege was visibly killing him, but the Sultan refused to withdraw or delegate command. His pride would not permit it. This insignificant fortress had defied him, had humiliated him, had made a mockery of his invincibility. He would see it fall if it cost him his last breath. It would. By late August, the siege had settled into a grinding war of attrition that favored neither side. The Ottomans had the numbers and the resources for a prolonged investment, but every day spent at Szigetvár was a day lost from the campaign season. Autumn was approaching. The roads would soon become mud. The opportunity to reach Vienna before winter would slip away. Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, the senior Ottoman commander after the Sultan himself, began to advocate for bypassing the fortress. Leave a screening force to contain the garrison, he argued, and continue the march toward Vienna with the main army. The strategic objective was the Habsburg capital, not this stubborn outpost. Let Szigetvár wither on the vine while Ottoman banners flew over Austrian walls. Suleiman refused. The fortress had become personal. Its continued resistance was an insult to his honor, a challenge to his authority, a stain on his legacy that could not be permitted to stand. Vienna would wait. Szigetvár would fall. The Sultan ordered a redoubling of efforts. Fresh troops were brought up from the rear. The artillery bombardment intensified. Mining operations expanded until the ground beneath the new town was honeycombed with tunnels. By September 1st, the defenses that had held for 9 days were finally crumbling. The breakthrough came on September 2nd. A coordinated series of mine explosions brought down multiple sections of the new town walls simultaneously. Ottoman assault troops stormed through the gaps before the dust had settled, overwhelming the defensive positions through sheer weight of numbers. Zrinyi, fighting in the front rank with a saber in each hand, was wounded 3 times but refused to leave the combat. The fighting in the new town streets was apocalyptic. Buildings burned. Men grappled in smoke and ash, their identities lost in the chaos. Croatian defenders fell back from barricade to barricade, selling each yard of ground for Ottoman blood. The dead lay so thick in some passages that survivors had to climb over the bodies to continue fighting. By nightfall, the new town had fallen. Zrinyi ordered the final withdrawal to the inner castle, the small island fortress that was Szigetvár's last redoubt. Fewer than 800 men made it across the causeway before the bridges were cut behind them. The inner castle was tiny, perhaps 100 yards across, surrounded by water and marsh, accessible only by a single narrow approach. It could not be seriously defended against the forces arrayed against it. Its walls were already damaged from the month-long bombardment. Its garrison was exhausted, wounded, starving. Its ammunition was nearly gone. Everyone inside knew this was the end. What the defenders of Szigetvár did not know, one outside Suleiman's immediate entourage knew, was that the siege had already claimed its most significant victim. On the night of September 5th, as Ottoman engineers prepared the final assault on the inner castle, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent died in his tent. The exact cause of death was never officially determined. Ottoman court protocols forbade detailed examination of the Sultan's corpse, and the physicians who attended him were subsequently executed to ensure their silence. Modern historians, working from fragmentary sources, have suggested various possibilities: heart failure, stroke, dysentery, or simply the cumulative exhaustion of a 71-year-old man subjected to the stress of a brutal campaign. What is certain is that Suleiman died within sight of victory, within hours of the assault that would finally reduce the fortress that had defied him for a month. He died listening to the sounds of bombardment, smelling the smoke from the burning castle, aware that his empire's mightiest army was still struggling against a few hundred wounded Croatians. The timing could not have been worse. The Ottoman army was poised for the final assault. Janissary commanders expected the attack order at dawn. If news of the Sultan's death spread through the camp, the psychological effect would be devastating. Mutiny was possible. Mass desertion was likely. The entire campaign could collapse into chaos. Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha made a decision that would define his legacy. He concealed the Sultan's death. The physician who had witnessed Suleiman's final moments was strangled within the hour. Servants who had attended the Sultan were quietly executed. The body was preserved as well as the available methods allowed, dressed in imperial robes and propped upright in the Sultan's carriage. Attendants were instructed to continue their usual activities around the imperial tent, preparing meals, carrying messages, maintaining the fiction of a living emperor. Sokolu forged imperial commands ordering the final assault on Szigetvár. He signed them with Suleiman's seal. He sent riders to the Janissary commanders with instructions that came, as far as anyone knew, from the shadow of God himself. The assault would proceed. The Sultan, officially, was merely resting in his tent, too exhausted from the campaign to personally witness the final victory. His armies would fight in his name, his glory would be secured, and no one would know the truth until it was far too late to matter. September 6th, 1566, the final night of the siege. Inside the inner castle, approximately 600 survivors of the original garrison gathered to hear their commander speak. The walls around them were burning. Ottoman artillery had set fire to the wooden structures throughout the compound, and there was no longer enough water to extinguish the flames. By morning, the entire castle would be an inferno. Anyone still inside would burn to death. Zrini assembled his men in the courtyard, the only space still relatively clear of smoke and debris. He was 58 years old. He had been wounded 7 times during the siege. His face was blackened with powder residue and ash. His voice, hoarse from shouting commands over the din of battle, could barely carry to the edges of the crowd. But every man strained to hear. According to accounts preserved by the few witnesses who survived the following day, Zrini spoke simply and directly. He did not offer false hope. He did not pretend that rescue might still come. He told them the truth. They would all die tomorrow. There was no escape. The only choice remaining was how they would die. They could burn in the castle, he said. The flames would take them before the Ottomans could breach the final walls. It would be painless, perhaps. Quick, certainly. No one would blame them for choosing that death. Or they could go out fighting. Zrinyi had prepared for this moment. In the powder magazine beneath the castle, 100 pounds of gunpowder waited with a slow-burning fuse. When the fuse burned down, timed for approximately 30 minutes after ignition, the explosion would destroy whatever remained of Szigetvár and kill anyone inside its walls. Ottoman soldiers pouring into the castle to claim their victory would die by the hundreds in the blast. The plan was straightforward. Light the fuse. Open the gates. Charge into the Ottoman lines. Fight until dead. And in dying, take as many of the enemy as possible into hell along with them. There was no tactical purpose to this final charge. 600 exhausted wounded men could not defeat 100,000 fresh troops. There was no possibility of breaking through the Ottoman siege lines or escaping into the countryside. This was not a military operation. It was a statement. Zrinyi asked if any man wished to attempt escape before the charge. The swamps around the castle offered routes that a desperate man might navigate in darkness. The Ottomans might not notice a few individuals slipping away in the chaos. No one would think less of them for trying to survive. According to every account that has come down to us, not a single man stepped forward. The defenders spent their last night preparing. They cleaned their weapons. They said their prayers. Those who had brought fine clothes, wedding garments, ceremonial robes, the silks they had saved for their burials, put them on. They would die as they had lived, proud, Croatian, unbowed. They waited for dawn. September 7th, 1566, 7 o'clock in the morning. The Ottoman bombardment resumes with the first light of day, but it is almost perfunctory. Everyone knows that today the siege will end. The inner castle is already burning. The walls are collapsing. There is nothing left to bombard. Janissary assault columns form before the narrow causeway that leads to the castle gate. 12,000 elite warriors prepare to storm a position defended by 600 walking wounded. Their commanders have told them this will be easy. A final cleanup operation, a victory march, a chance to claim plunder before the army continues toward Vienna. Inside the burning castle, Count Miklos Zrinyi lights the fuse. He is wearing a silk keftan given to him by the Sultan himself years ago, during one of the brief periods of peace between the empires. Around his neck hangs a golden chain worth 100 ducats. In his belt is strapped the key to the powder magazine, a final irony ensuring that even in death he will carry the instrument of Ottoman destruction. His men are arrayed behind him in the courtyard. They are not a military formation anymore. They are something else, something that transcends the normal categories of warfare. They are men who have already died and been born again into a purpose that admits no fear. The castle gate opens. What happens next unfolds in seconds but will be remembered for centuries. 600 men charge down the narrow causeway toward the Ottoman lines. They are screaming, a wordless roar of defiance that rises above the crackling flames and the thunder of cannon. They are firing their last ammunition as they run, cutting down the front ranks of the surprised Janissaries. They are swinging sabers, wielding pikes, killing with their bare hands when their weapons break. Zrinyi leads from the front. He cuts down 3 Ottoman soldiers before a musket ball strikes his chest. He staggers, but does not fall. He kills another man. A second musket ball hits him in the head. He goes down. The charge does not stop. The surviving defenders trample over their commander's body, over Ottoman dead, over the dying and the screaming and the fallen. They fight with the strength of madmen, the strength of the already dead, the strength of men who have converted their fear into something harder than steel. The Ottoman lines buckle. For a few impossible minutes, the 12,000 Janissaries fall back before 600 charging ghosts. The charge has momentum. It has fury. It has the weight of 33 days of suffering and sacrifice compressed into one final eruption of violence. And then, inevitably, the numbers prevail. The Ottoman officers rally their troops. Fresh regiments pour in from the flanks. The charging defenders are surrounded, encircled, overwhelmed. One by one, they fall, shot, stabbed, crushed beneath the weight of superior numbers. Within 30 minutes, every defender is dead. The Ottoman soldiers pour into the burning castle, eager to claim plunder, to celebrate their victory. Thousands of them crowd into the narrow confines, searching for treasure, killing the wounded, stripping the dead. And then the powder magazine explodes. The explosion kills approximately 3,000 Ottoman soldiers in an instant. Witnesses on the outskirts of the siege lines describe a column of fire that rises higher than the castle walls. Debris, stone, timber, human bodies, rains down across a quarter-mile radius. The concussion knocks men from their feet 100 yards from the blast site. For a long moment after the explosion, there's only smoke and silence. Then the screaming begins. The wounded are everywhere. Men with limbs torn off, men with burns covering their bodies, men blinded by the flash, deafened by the blast, wandering through the ruins in shock. The Ottoman army, which had been celebrating its victory moments before, is now facing a mass casualty event for which it is completely unprepared. And in the chaos, a terrible rumor begins to spread. The Sultan is dead. This rumor is, of course, true, but for the wrong reasons. The soldiers believe that Suleiman was killed in the explosion, that the defenders' final act of defiance claimed not just thousands of Janissaries, but the shadow of God himself. Panic ripples through the Ottoman camp. Units begin to desert their positions. Commanders struggle to maintain order. Grand Vizier Sokolu acts with desperate speed. He orders the Sultan's preserved body dressed in imperial robes and displayed briefly to senior officers, proving that Suleiman survived the explosion. He issues commands in the Sultan's name, threatening death to anyone who spreads rumors of the emperor's demise. He takes personal control of the army, wielding authority that he does not officially possess, holding the empire together through sheer force of will. It works. The panic subsides. Discipline is restored. The army does not dissolve into chaos, but the campaign is over. Sokolu knows that he cannot continue toward Vienna. The army has lost over 25,000 men, killed in the assaults, in the explosion, from disease and exhaustion. The campaign season is nearly over. The men are demoralized, shocked, traumatized by what they have witnessed. Pushing forward would risk a catastrophic defeat that could threaten the empire itself. On September 8, 1566, one day after the fall of Szigetvár, the Ottoman army begins its retreat toward Constantinople. Vienna is saved. Europe is saved. And the 2,300 men who made it possible lie buried in the ashes of a castle that no longer exists. The retreat from Szigetvár was unlike any withdrawal in Ottoman history. It was, in fact, a 48-day theater performance designed to conceal the death of an emperor. Every morning, servants entered Suleiman's tent as though preparing the Sultan for the day's march. Every evening, meals were delivered to his quarters and removed, untouched, by trusted attendants. Physicians reported on the Sultan's improving health. Commanders received written orders bearing the imperial seal. And at the center of this elaborate fiction, Suleiman's embalmed corpse sat propped in his carriage, dressed in robes of state, occasionally displayed through a carefully positioned window to reassure troops that their emperor still lived. Sokolu was ruthless in maintaining the deception. Anyone who expressed doubt about the Sultan's condition disappeared. The physician who had attended Suleiman's final hours was strangled. Servants who knew too much were killed. The number of people aware of the truth dwindled to a handful of the Grand Vizier's most trusted agents. The reason for this extraordinary secrecy was purely political. Suleiman's death would trigger a succession crisis. His son Selim was waiting in Constantinople to claim the throne, but Ottoman succession was never peaceful. Other claimants might emerge. Janissaries might demand concessions in exchange for their loyalty. Provincial governors might seize the opportunity to break away from imperial control. The entire structure of Ottoman power could collapse if the transition was not managed with absolute precision. Sokollu's deception bought time. For 48 days, the empire functioned as though nothing had changed. Orders flowed from the imperial tent. Tribute continued to arrive. Potential rivals remained uncertain about their moment. When the army finally reached Belgrade, Sokollu judged that the danger had passed. Selim had been notified by secret courier and had secured Constantinople. The succession was assured. On October 21st, 1566, 6 weeks after Suleiman's actual death, the Grand Vizier publicly announced that the Sultan had passed away. The mourning was genuine. The grief was real. Suleiman the Magnificent had ruled for 46 years, longer than most of his subjects had been alive. His death marked the end of an era. But the manner of that death, exhausted, frustrated, defeated by a handful of Croatians in a swamp fortress, was quietly erased from the official narrative. Ottoman historians recorded that Suleiman died peacefully, having witnessed his army's glorious victory at Szigetvár. The truth was too embarrassing to preserve. What did the Siege of Szigetvár actually accomplish? What was the historical significance of 2,300 men dying in a castle that most Europeans had never heard of? The immediate consequences were straightforward. The Ottoman campaign of 1566, the largest military expedition Suleiman had ever undertaken, designed to finally conquer Vienna and establish Ottoman supremacy over Central Europe, failed completely. The army that retreated from Szigetvár was in no condition to threaten anyone. It had lost a quarter of its strength, including thousands of irreplaceable elite troops. It had consumed an entire campaign season. It had buried its sultan. Vienna did not fall in 1566. It would not fall in 1583 when the Ottomans tried again. It would hold against the Great Siege of 1683, the last major Ottoman attempt to conquer Central Europe. Each time, the memory of Szigetvár loomed over the defenders, proof that Ottoman invincibility was a myth, that a determined garrison could make even the greatest empire bleed. The strategic impact extended far beyond the immediate campaign. The Ottoman Empire had reached its high water mark. After Suleiman, there would be no more great sultans leading armies in person. The empire would continue to exist for centuries, would continue to pose a threat to Christian Europe, would continue to win battles and conquer territories. But the era of limitless expansion was over. The momentum had broken. Historians debate how much credit Szigetvár deserves for this transformation. The Ottoman Empire was already showing signs of overextension before 1566. Its economy was strained. Its military technology was beginning to fall behind European innovations. Its political system was vulnerable to the weaknesses of individual sultans in ways that more distributed governments were not. But symbolism matters. Szigetvár demonstrated that the Ottomans could be stopped, not by great armies or powerful kingdoms, but by ordinary men who refused to yield. That demonstration echoed through the following centuries, stiffening resistance in places that might otherwise have surrendered, encouraging defiance in contexts where submission had previously seemed the only option. Count Miklos Zrinyi's body was found in the rubble outside the castle gate. He had been shot twice, once in the chest, once in the head, and his skull had been partially crushed by the impact of his fall. Ottoman soldiers, recognizing his armor and insignia, severed his head and brought it to the Grand Vizier as a trophy. Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, the same man who was simultaneously concealing his sultan's death, treated Zrinyi's remains with unexpected respect. He ordered the head reunited with the body and arranged for both to be transported to Christian territory for proper burial. In a letter to the Habsburg Emperor, Sokollu praised Zrínyi as a worthy adversary, a brave man who had defended his post with honor. This was not mere courtesy. Sokollu was a pragmatist who understood the value of chivalric gestures. But there was also genuine admiration in his words. The Grand Vizier had watched the siege from beginning to end. He had seen what 2,300 men could do when they decided that their deaths would mean something. Zrínyi's body was eventually interred at his family estate in Čakovec, in what is now northern Croatia. His tomb became a pilgrimage site. His story became a legend, retold in poems, plays, operas, and eventually films across 5 centuries. The Hungarians claimed him as their hero. The Croats claimed him as theirs. Both were right. The other defenders of Szigetvár received no individual memorials. Their names, for the most part, are lost. They were farmers and merchants and minor nobles, men whose individual lives left no mark on the historical record. They are remembered only collectively, as a number, 2,300, and as a symbol. But perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the anonymity is appropriate. They did not fight for personal glory. They did not expect to be remembered by name. They fought because their deaths could purchase something their lives could not. Time for their families, safety for their kingdoms, survival for their civilization. They made the calculation. They paid the price. And history remembers the transaction, if not the individuals who made it. The Siege of Szigetvár cast a shadow that extends to the present day. In Hungary and Croatia, the battle became a foundational myth, a story of national heroism that transcended the political divisions of subsequent centuries. When the Habsburg Empire collapsed in 1918, the new nations that emerged from its ruins each claimed Szigetvár as part of their heritage. When those nations fell under communist rule after World War II, the story was adapted to serve new ideological purposes. Zrínyi recast as a proto-socialist hero, the defenders as proto-proletarians resisting imperial aggression. In Turkey, the siege occupies a more ambivalent place in national memory. The conquest of Szigetvár was technically a victory. The fortress fell, its defenders were killed, Ottoman sovereignty was extended over one more piece of Hungarian territory. But the cost of that victory and the circumstances of Suleiman's death were embarrassments that complicated the narrative. Turkish historians have generally preferred to emphasize other aspects of Suleiman's reign. His legal reforms, his architectural patronage, his expansion of Ottoman territories in other theaters. The fortress itself no longer exists. What the siege did not destroy, subsequent centuries erased. The marshland was drained. The ruins were demolished or incorporated into later structures. A modern town called Szigetvár occupies the approximate site, with monuments and memorials marking the location of the famous last stand. Archaeologists have excavated portions of the original fortifications, recovering cannonballs, weapon fragments, and the bones of men dead for 4.5 centuries. Perhaps the most poignant memorial is the joint Hungarian-Turkish Friendship Park, established in 1994 on a hill near the battlefield. It contains the symbolic tombs of both Zrínyi and Suleiman, enemies in life, united in death, commemorated together by nations that have long since ceased to be at war. The park acknowledges a truth that the siege itself demonstrated. The men who fight and die in these conflicts are often more alike than different, bound by the same codes of honor, facing the same fears, making the same impossible choices. History is written by survivors, but sometimes the dead have the last word. We began this story with a question. How did 2,300 men save Europe from the Ottoman Empire? The answer is not simple. History does not operate through clean cause and effect relationships. The Ottoman Empire did not fail to conquer Europe solely because of Szigetvár. Millions of other factors, economic, technological, political, demographic, contributed to the eventual stabilization of the European Ottoman frontier. To claim that Zrinyi and his men single-handedly saved a continent is to indulge in the kind of heroic simplification that real history rarely supports. And yet, there are moments when history pivots, moments when the accumulated weight of large forces produces a balance so delicate that individual choices can tip the scales. August 1566 was such a moment. The Ottoman army was within reach of its greatest prize. Nothing stood between Suleiman and Vienna except 90 miles of open plain and one small fortress on the Hungarian frontier. What would have happened if Szigetvár had fallen in 3 days as Ottoman commanders expected? What if the army had reached Vienna in September, while the weather was still favorable and the garrison was still unprepared? What if Suleiman had lived long enough to personally command the siege of the Habsburg capital? We cannot know. History does not permit experiments. We cannot rerun 1566 with different variables and observe the results. But we can say this. The men of Szigetvár did everything in their power to make the Ottoman conquest of Europe more difficult, more costly, more time-consuming. They exchanged their lives for 33 days that the Habsburg Empire used to strengthen its defenses. They killed 25,000 enemy soldiers who would not be available for future campaigns. They exhausted a sultan who died before completing his work. They gave Europe a chance. What Europe did with that chance was Europe's responsibility, but the chance itself was purchased with Croatian and Hungarian blood in a swamp fortress that most of the continent never knew existed. There is a memorial in Szigetvár that bears an inscription adapted from Zrinyi's final speech. A man can die only once, and he cannot escape death. Let the memory of our names be immortal. This is, in some ways, an optimistic sentiment. The belief that sacrifice confers meaning, that dying well compensates for dying young, that history will remember those who gave everything for something larger than themselves. Reality is often less generous. Most of the men who died at Szigetvár are, in fact, forgotten. We do not know their names. We do not know their faces. We do not know whether they had families, what they hoped for, what they feared. They are numbers in a ledger. 2,300 souls traded for 33 days of an empire's time. But perhaps that is the wrong way to measure their sacrifice. The men of Szigetvár did not fight because they expected to be remembered. They fought because they understood something about sacrifice that comfortable ages often forget, that dying for something can be more meaningful than living for nothing, that a brief life, fully committed to a purpose, can accomplish more than a long life spent in self-preservation, that there are worse things than death, and one of them is survival, purchased through betrayal of everything you believe in. They could have surrendered, they could have negotiated, they could have slipped away in the night and let the Ottomans have their fortress. No one would have blamed them. The mathematics were impossible. The outcome was certain. Resistance was irrational by any standard measure. They resisted anyway. They fought for 33 days. They died with their swords in their hands and their honor intact. And 5 centuries later, we are still telling their story. That is the measure of sacrifice. Not whether history remembers your name, but whether history remembers that someone, somewhere, chose to die rather than submit. Not whether your individual life is commemorated, but whether your collective choice echoes through generations of people who never knew you but inherited the world you helped create. The men of Szigetvár gave everything. They asked for nothing in return except that their deaths mean something. They meant something. They still do.